Hi everyone, welcome. I'm about to head downstairs into my wormery, but before I do, we're checking in on my tracking spreadsheet. This tracking spreadsheet is where I keep all of my active bins listed, showing what's happened with them over the course of time, keeping track of various information about them. And the systems that I'm checking in on today are the two oldest of my Red Wiggler systems up here. One of them is 150 days old, the other is 128 days old. And it was 12 days ago that I tried to initiate the migration of the worms out of the material. The material seemed like it was getting really hard and clumpy and just not right. So I wanted to try to give the worms an opportunity to exit that material. I set up horizontal feeding migration zones to try to give the worms a chance to exit the material on their own. And, you know, over those past 12 days, it does seem like the older of the two bins has been doing pretty good with worms making their way into that migration feeding zone. But the younger of the two bins, the 128-day-old system, when I peeked in there yesterday, it seemed like there were pretty much no worms remaining, maybe a handful of worms. And I'm going to just call that system quits at this point, regardless of the fact that maybe there's still a few worms in there. I don't want to leave them in there any longer. I'm going to try to extract them manually, get whatever worms I can save out of there. I'll just dump them into that other system that's still migrating the worms. And then since after 12 days, it seems like the food that was in the feeding zone of that older system has been to a large degree depleted already. I'm going to reinforce the feeding in that area, and we'll just let that migration continue. So before heading down there, I thought we'd really quick check on my tracking spreadsheet, see what the game plan for today was. So let's head down there now and get to work. Okay, now we're starting in the system where I believe that the most dire need is, which is the younger of the two, where I really just want to get the worms out. And it was kind of shocking yesterday when I came in here and I found all kinds of flying insects and what appear to be just tons of creepy crawly insects either flying around or crawling around. It just seems to me like the worms have died off and the bugs have moved in. So if I'm able to, you know, rescue any worms out of here, that's great. I'm going to pull them out and then we'll release them into the other bin that we're going to check in on. But when I was in here yesterday, it did seem like the number of surviving worms are rather minimal, and anything I find, big, small, whether it's lethargic or active, I'm pulling them out and I'm going to be relocating them. So right off the bat, I found one little tiny worm here. So I'm just going to gradually go through this, and if there's any worms that I miss, then they'll just kind of end up in my garden, because I'm going to dump this castings material out in my garden. And even though there's a lot of mites cruising around within this material, I don't have any plants growing out there yet, and I don't even know if mites really cause problems for plants. But I'm assuming that if I release these mites out into the garden along with the compost, it's not going to be a problem. At least I hope that's the case. It's pretty much what most people have suggested that I should do. It would be kind of a shame to let some nice castings material go to waste. And if there is really something going wrong with this castings material, hopefully by just sitting out in the garden for a little while, it'll be whipped into shape either by the UV sunlight or, you know, just by nature. I'm not even sure what to expect, but I'm not expecting any sort of ill effects by releasing or by, you know, placing this material outside into the garden. I don't know. I might have a change of heart. I might end up just dumping it somewhere else, maybe to like fill in a hole or something if I kind of lose my nerve and start getting suspicious that the material does have some sort of an issue that could cause problems for my garden once I get around to planting. And the other thing that some people suggested was, hey, besides picking the worms out, if you stumble on any cocoons, it would make good sense to extract them too. So I'm definitely, you know, on the lookout for cocoons as well. if I see any. I'll certainly move them out too. But I'm really just more interested in the worms themselves. And if any cocoons end up going outside with this castings material, you know, they'll hatch out in the open air outside, and they'll have dirt to live in, and they'll be free. So if I don't end up collecting any cocoons, or I just don't end up finding any to collect, that doesn't mean that any cocoons that do remain in the material will have some sort of a drastic end. They'll just be free. They'll be outside. And it's hard to tell. Little tiny worm does not seem to be moving. So I really didn't even intend to film this too much. I figured maybe at the end, once I do collect as many worms as I could find, I would show them prior to releasing them in the other system. So I'm gonna cut the camera and just work my way through this gradually, doing my best to locate and extract any worms that I can find. Just that if I'm really quick about it, I may end up pulling out dead worms, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But these poor worms, whatever it is that's going awry in this bin, seems to be making them very lethargic and slow on the move. So even if they are alive still, they're not very lively, the poor things. So I do look forward to getting them released into a more hospitable environment. And the other bin that the migration is occurring in does seem to be a happy, healthy environment that the worms are doing just fine in. So I think that'll be a good place to release them. And it's only releasing them into that bin temporarily because the contents of that bin will be released into a new environment soon. But I want to give time for that migration to build up some nice momentum and get a good bunch of worms together before I get into releasing them into a new space. So yeah, why don't we pause the camera here briefly as I continue with the collection of worms, and then we'll regroup closer to the end when I feel like I've pretty much collected all the worms I can find. And then we'll be done with this bin. And then at that point, this bin will be officially over. And it will not be a big time worm release like we usually do when we bring closure to a bin. It'll be kind of a mini worm release with these worms that I collect, whatever ones I'm able to rescue. So yeah, let's do that. I'll be back later. So I felt the need to become a little bit more systematic, so I had nudged all the material off to my right, and I've been gradually picking through it, moving stuff over to the side, and I'm now finally in the middle area, which is where the feeding zone had been. And I did stumble on a piece of food that would normally become a pretty attractive place to find a lot of worms. It's the stem of a banana, and I broke it open, which is where you would normally expect to find at least a couple worms dining on the fruity, fresh insides of the stem, but nothing. And as you can see in my little collection container here too, I've hardly collected any worms since we last checked in, which must have been at least 10 minutes ago that I've been searching and picking, and I found maybe a couple cocoons and maybe a handful of worms. But as we work our way to the center here, which is where the fresh bedding and food had been placed, my hope is that I will manage to collect a few more worms than I've found so far. But, you know, of all this material that I've picked through since we last checked in about 10 or 15 minutes ago, I've hardly found any worms. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Hopefully as we work our way into the middle area here, we'll start seeing more. But it does not seem like we're going to have a very big worm extraction when this is all said and done. So I just figured I would check in really quick since I'm approaching what appears to be about the halfway point. and maybe more like a third if I compare the amount of material that I still have to inspect before I'm done here. So yeah, making progress slowly but surely. So as you can see, I'm more or less in the center of the bin at this point, so I'm at least halfway through the material that had made up the feeding zone that I had built in the middle here. And as I continue, I do encounter fairly large chunks of bedding and food bits, but no greater concentration of worms than we saw in the beginning. In fact, when we first started, it seems like we must have gotten very lucky, because for us to have been able to collect that many worms while the camera was rolling in the beginning seems almost like a huge stroke of luck compared to what I've encountered since. Even though I'm right in the middle where there was all this fresh bedding, fresh food, and everything else placed 12 days ago. Well, not 12 days ago, but you know what I mean. It does not seem like it's providing any sort of advantage in terms of finding more worms here. So you could still see I'm very limited on the number of worms that I've managed to rescue out of here. And I found one or two more cocoons too, but it's not really what I'm looking for. I'm definitely just keeping an eye out for anything squirmy and alive. See if I can extract them and rescue them out of this container. But pretty soon I think we're going to make our way through the center area where all the food and fresh bedding and everything was. And we're not really encountering much as far as worms are concerned. I have been trying to collect up all of the larger scraps of bedding and food that I encounter along the way to kind of keep it separate from the stuff that appears to be mostly castings. But there too, I'm not going too out of my way to bother with that. I'm really just trying to see if I could find any worms, get them the heck out of here, and then this will be a done deal as far as this container goes. How unfortunate. Luckily we got a few that survived, but look at that, hardly anything. A couple dozen at best. All right. On it goes. So as you can see, I'm approaching the far end of the bin. I've already made it through the center area where the food and fresh bedding were located, and at no point did I sense that I was encountering any sort of concentration of more worms. So it does seem like the remaining surviving worms in this are very few and far between. I've collected maybe another 2 or 3 since last time we checked in. I don't know, maybe 5 or 6, but certainly nothing very notable. I would just take a chunk of this material and sort of, oh, there's a worm. I would just sort of try to break it up and then maybe wait a moment or two just to see if, I can observe anything squirming within the material. But the one thing I do notice a lot is not squirming, but creeping. A lot of little stuff running around, mostly mites, I believe. So maybe I'm going to just shoot a quick little short time-lapse segment just so we can get a better view to see what it is that's creeping and crawling around this material. A lot of times the time-lapse reveals stuff that the naked eye can't really see in real time. Oops. So let's give that a try for a minute or two. I'm just curious. Well, I gave that a good, I don't even know, 7 or 8 minutes to run. I wanted a good 15 or 20 seconds worth of time-lapse footage to observe what the creepy crawly action in here looks like. I mean, just from looking down into the bin, I can see things crawling around, but I think just from being able to see the whole mass in movement, it just helps a little bit in terms of visualizing what's really happening in here. These little guys, I just figured I would give them a little squirt of water too to make it a little bit more hospitable for them over here. So and you can see they're kind of balling up together underneath these little particles of material that came along with them. So it doesn't look like they're trying to escape anymore. But I really don't have a great deal more to go here, and I certainly don't expect to find many more worms. So that means we're going to be ready to release these little guys into a safer, more comfortable environment pretty soon. And at the same time, we're going to be, see, once in a while you see a worm who's not looking too good, kind of like that string of pearls look to them. I don't know if it's coming through on the camera, but there are like distinct little sections of the body where, it seems like it's withered away to practically nothing. And here and there you can see all kinds of little tiny mites zipping around, probably already feasting on these carcasses, or soon to be carcasses. I don't think either of those worms were alive, unfortunately. Here and there, like I said, I'm picking off cocoons if I spot them, but I'm not going too much out of my way to collect them. I've only found a handful of them here and there. But they do blend in quite a bit. It's hard to see them. And it even makes me wonder if it's still possible for them to be viable anymore, or maybe mites have already jumped on those too as maybe a easy source of food to pick on. I don't know. So we're nearing the end here. Not much left to do. I'll just clean out the remainder of this stuff over here on the edge, rescue any remaining worms that I encounter, and then we'll be able to move on to the other bin where, like I said, we're going to release these worms into that space, into that other bin, and at the same time we're going to reinforce the feeding of that other bin. So while I was waiting for the time lapse to complete, I bought down some foods with which to do that. So I'm going to shut the camera off again here, and I'll probably just wrap up the remainder of this offline, and then we'll proceed to the next bin once I'm finished. As you can see, I'm close to the end, and I've maybe found one or two more worms. But it's kind of crazy when you look at what's in my hand. I mean, I don't need a time lapse or anything to see what's happening here. There is just tons and tons of mites crawling all over this stuff. There must be little pockets of really delicious stuff that they're really digging over here, and I don't know what it is. And I don't blame the mites for what's happened in this bin, because I think that they just kind of came as an after effect of whatever it is that did in the poor worms. I think they just sort of saw it as an opportunity of, a whole bunch of dead worms. So they just kind of had a little bit of a population explosion because of the abundance of food, which in this case would have been the dead worms themselves. But I can only imagine what it must be for these remaining surviving worms with all this mite activity. Wow, it's amazing. In the corner I just found like 3 or 4 worms huddled together, probably trying to avoid these blasted mites that are, who knows, at this point maybe the mites are actually killing off the remainder of the worms that are still alive in here. But you could see we've hardly collected any. I could probably count these in a couple minutes, and there's probably no more than a couple dozen. And I gotta say, it was a pretty time-consuming effort to do this. So for a couple dozen worms, it almost seems like it was hardly worth the effort. I could have just as easily thrown this material out in the yard, and whatever remaining worms still survived, they could have just probably squirmed out of this stuff. Well, I think I've pretty much scoured through this material to the best of my ability and extracted every worm that I was able to encounter and locate. So we're going to consider this now as a done deal. This this bin is going to be marked off as complete, and I'm just going to empty the material out into the garden at some point. I'm wondering if I might just leave it for a few days just to let maybe the mite population somehow dissipate or something. I'm not really sure what to make of it. Maybe I'll just create a pile of it somewhere instead of trying to blend it all in, and then maybe the mites on their own will gradually dissipate or whatever the case may be. I just wouldn't want to trigger sort of a big infestation of mites out somewhere. Like I said, I might even just dump this material in a place that's away from the garden just in case it might cause troubles. But that's it. An unfortunate end to yet another of my bins. I've been kind of on an unlucky streak here. And all this stuff right here was the bedding and food bits that I picked out along the way that seemed like it was uncomposted material. Here too, I don't know how much of it might be mite infested. And as tempting as it is to just place it into my outdoor bin or my outdoor worm bin or something to let the composting process of that material continue, I might just keep all this stuff together, isolated, at least until such a time that I sense that the mite activity in it has settled down a bit. So let's set this thing aside. Its next stop is going to be outside. And then the bin is going to get a good cleaning and sterilization, I believe, at this point. All right, everyone, let's get on to the other bin. And I'll definitely wash my hands too, along that same line of thinking as sterilizing this bin, just in case there is something in here that's causing the problem. We don't want to transfer it from one bin to the other. All right, onward. All right, so now here in the 150-day-old container, things do seem like they're a little bit more stable. Let's knock on wood with that because I don't know for sure. It was just my impulse or my instinct just from having checked in here yesterday. That other bin that we just finished emptying and rescuing the worms out of, it had tons of flying insects hanging out all over the paper that was covering the material in that container. There were all kinds of warning signs. A lot more mite activity. There's probably mites in here too, but not nearly as bad as we saw. And then, you know, I guess the other good sign in here was that when we did inspect this feeding area, there did seem to be a good number of worms that have already made their way over. However, there's still also a good number of worms that are still present in this material too. Now, one thing I'd really like to try to achieve here when I finally get around to relocating the worms out of this bin into their new home is to leave behind any mites. So to try to reach that goal, I've actually got a new something that I'm going to give a try here. This is, some people refer to as NEEM cake. NEEM seed meal is what the packaging refers to here. I had at one point tried NEEM oil, but it appears that the NEEM oil that I had tried in my bins to battle the mites was not the right kind, and it wasn't going to work in the first place, so it was almost like a wasted effort, wasted expense. Turns out that the type of neem seed oil that does work is the type that's been cold pressed, whatever that means. So, ooh, look at that, many worms. So luckily the neem oil that I had placed into my affiliate links in my video descriptions and into my pinned comments is the type that has been cold pressed. So that oil is apparently working well for some people in their efforts to combat mites in their worm bins. So I was really pleased to hear that some people who had tried the neem oil that was listed in my affiliate links in my description was working well for them. But I had not really realized that, and I did not opt for more neem oil of the correct type. In this case, I figured I would try the neem cake going forward to see if I can use that to reduce or eliminate the mites. And this will actually be my first attempt at using this stuff. But before we go into here and we add the food that I bought down in here to help beef up and continue this feeding zone's action, I want to just give this other end of the bin where the finished castings are another little stir. I know it was only a day ago when I gave this stuff a stir, but it did feel like the material on the surface had a chance to dry a little bit. So I figured I would blend it in, help bring some of the more damp material up to the surface, and submerge the drier stuff to let that soak in some of the dampness. And every time I stir this stuff, it does feel like it's getting more and more crumbly, and approaching that better consistency that we all like to see in our worm bins. A nice flowing, crumbly type castings material, not a material that is all clumped together like mud or clay. And I think just from, ooh, there's a good number of worms right there, but I think just from picking through, we could clearly tell from the initial stir that I gave this end of the bin, there was a whole lot more worm action over here close to the feeding area and where the plastic was covering things up because of the moisture circulating over there. I think that's part of the reason, maybe the draw or the attraction of the food that I've been placing into here. But the one thing we did notice last time, yesterday, when we checked out how things were looking in this feeding zone, it did seem like things were starting to run a little bit low. There was still a banana peel, or what remains of a banana peel in there, and maybe the couple butt ends of a little, maybe the stem of head of lettuce or whatever it was. A couple chunks of food remaining in the feeding area, as well as a bunch of nice, leftover leaves and stuff that had been used as bedding. But it did seem like it would be a good idea to reinforce the feeding area, just to make sure it doesn't start to run low, and just to make sure that the appeal of the feeding area doesn't diminish any. And as long as we're at it, we might as well also increase its size a little bit too, So I figured the fresh stuff I would put all the way outboard, far over on the edge, and move all of this partially worked material in a little bit. So out here on the edge, before we plop in the fresh food, I'm going to throw in a little bit more bedding material to reinforce that. It's a collection of leaves that I bought in from outside not too long ago, but I did make a stop at the microwave oven in the kitchen to make sure that I'm not bringing in any, more mites or pests or anything like that. So this stuff has been sort of sterilized, if you will. But that right there looks like a pretty nice initial layer of bedding to place in under the food. So then, what do we have here? We've got a chunk of purple cabbage. We've got the peels from some mangoes here. Previously, I was trying to be kind of selective on the types of foods where I'm concerned about having mites, thinking that the sweeter, more succulent types of foods might, attract and cause the outbreak of mite populations. But I'm going to put a little bit of faith into the neem cake at this point. So I'm hoping that that's actually going to serve as a sort of bait to lure the mites over there. And then what they're going to encounter is some neem cake. Now, I've never used this stuff, so I'm going to just put in an amount that seems to be similar to what I think I saw demonstrated in some other videos. I think I watched a Crazy Worm Lady video where I saw her put some in, maybe not quite so much, I don't know. You know what, let's go ahead and throw a little bit right onto the perimeter there on the edge. And then I guess I'll give this whole pile of stuff a little bit of a stir to get the neem cake blended in a little bit. From what I understand, the worms really dig the neem cake, but it affects the mites in such a way that they stop reproducing or they stop eating or whatever. So my hope is that by including neem cake here in the reinforcement of the feeding area of my migration feeding zone in these bins, that maybe when it all is said and done and when it comes time to relocate these worms to a new home, perhaps we're going to be able to do so without bringing any mites along for the ride. So hopefully I've done it in a way that's consistent with getting good positive results. If anyone out there who's used this stuff thinks that I could have done a better job there or done it differently for better results, then open to any tips or suggestions. So the only other thing remaining, I guess, is to release our very few collected red wigglers out of the other container. Gosh, so few worms. I feel so bad for these little guys. But hopefully they'll be happy here in this new home. In fact, I'm going to position them right next to the spot where I'm trying to get all the worms to collect. And if they want to go wandering out into the finished compost, they're welcome to. But my hope is that they make their way into the feeding zone, and then they'll already be where I want them at the end. So that's where we stand now with the migration of my mixed bin. I refer to it as a red wiggler bin, but this is the bin that's got the European night crawlers mixed in with the red wigglers, as well as some Indian blue worms. I don't know what kind of concentration or ratio, but it is a mixed bag of different types of worms in here. So I'm going to be coming back in here to continue agitating this material to help it dry, to help it air out and become less and less of a place where the worms want to continue to be. As this stuff dries, it'll become, you know, material that the worms are probably going to want to exit and go find a more comfortable place to be. So I'll be trying to help the material air out and dry off with periodic stirs, and maybe I won't wait so long between check-ins. But I am glad to see that at least one of these two systems that I attempted the migration in is actually successfully driving towards a good end. And it is kind of regrettable that that other system just ended the way it did, but oh well, c'est la vie. Such is life. Alright everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.